Awesome. Awesome. How's everybody tonight? Hope everybody's okay. You're on mute, so you can't really say much about whether you're good or not. I'm assuming you're well. Um, I appreciate everybody coming in. Expect a few more likely. At least that's what I understand. So we will let them roll in when they get here. Tonight I wanted to chat about just a couple of things, but one of the things I wanted to talk about, it's one of the funner topics. I talk about story a lot, and people will ask me, they go, why do you do that? Because, a lot of the other people would talk about concepts or one of the other things. And I don't know, I've always felt that kind of to the Western and certainly the American ear, that the sense of a story is more tangible. It has movement in it. It has a sense that it's something that you're actually doing. It's how we use the term. So, but nonetheless, it is still it's still a concept. So story is something that, as I said before, it's kind of like the theme music that we put with life as it arises. So our intellect dresses up what we see and what arises, and we end up calling that a story. So our mind is really good. I mean, what really exists is only right here and right now. So think about how that works, is that the arising, whatever is here and now, gets recorded, as it were, almost like a video recording, and then gets turned into a story. We put the theme music in it. So in a way, we're like these very famous mixers that sit up and they mix music and speech and movies, because they have a visual track and then they have this music that goes with it. And so that's what our intellect does. Our intellect creates that MP4, if you want to call it that, whatever format you like. So think about what happens, though, is that and what automatic behavior is when story is so accepted and is so normal to us that it lives inside of us without, without us noticing that it's there. So how does that happen? So I'm going to talk about that in a sec. So in California, for those of you who are familiar with California, California is a place where we love to drive cars. It's one of the places where car driving is almost worshipped as something that you have to do in order to be Californian. And Californians have this really kind of thing that they do that's really fun. And that is, when they drive along, if someone cuts you off, they have a special one-finger salute that they use for you. And it usually goes with the worst expletive that you can imagine, because cutting somebody off on the road is considered a sin, if you will, or it's considered something you really shouldn't do. And so you'll see California drivers, they're close to not happy a lot of the time, because there's a lot of people cutting each other off. A lot happens out on the road. Now, it's kind of interesting that, that's what happens. So what is the story that they assume? They assume anybody who cuts them off did that on purpose and wasn't watching or taking care of them. That's what the story is. So one of the ways to look at story is to say, hey, wait a minute. Story actually is something that covers all situations. So what happens if the fellow who is driving the car, I'm assuming it's a fellow in this dream scenario I'm creating here, and he cuts in front of you because he's in a hurry to the emergency room, and he has his daughter in the car whose life hangs in the balance. Now, if I tell you that, now what's your reaction when this car cuts you off? Entirely different reaction. You're like, oh my goodness, how can I help this person? What could I do so that this person could be helped? And that's a different story. But notice that unless you consciously and in the moment create a different story, there's a default story in place. Somebody cuts me off on the freeway, they're an asshole. and I'm going to give them the one-fingered salute, and I'm going to mention it. Certainly I'm going to mutter under my breath in my own car. I may even scream in my own car if there's nobody in there with me, but that's the assumed story that's in place. And we call that automatic behavior. So how does automatic behavior happen? Well, here's how it happens. The best example I can think of, I got 2 car driving stories. So for all of you that learned how to drive a car, go back to the moment when you were just learning how to drive a car. And I don't know if you remember, but you got in the car and holy cow, there's like, I'm not kidding you, there's all of these dials and buttons, and there's a wheel, and if you have a stick shift, there's pedals on the floor, there's seat belts, and that's just in the car. And then you go out onto the street, and there's signs and lines on the road, and there are people doing all sorts of things that clearly they know how to do, and clearly you don't. Now, if you remember those early days, you had to really think your way through everything, because you had to account for it. Say, okay, turn the engine on. Okay, put the key in the ignition, turn the engine on. Good, now the engine's going. Got it. Now the next thing is, oh yeah, the garage door needs to be up. Okay, make sure that's up. All right, now I'm going to put it in reverse. And then when I get in reverse, now I need to look both ways. Remember that, because if you're going to back out of your garage, you got to look both ways. And wow, what's the street look like? And can I back out, or how am I going to get on the street? And then when I do that, and that's how we drove in the beginning. We were incredible. And that sounds awkward, but it's incredibly conscious. You have to think about every single step when you first drive. Fair enough. Fast forward 2 weeks, and out you go into the garage. You know, you hit the button for the thing, for the garage door. You jump in the car. You may even turn the radio on before you do anything else. You slap the thing, you turn the engine on, slap it into reverse, and you pop out on the street, and down the road you go. What's happened in between? Well, humans are built a little like computers. And so what we have is we have a conscious section in our world. And in order for the human body mind to really reach its potential, it needs to be efficient in stuff that it already knows how to do. So there's a box inside of us somewhere in our brain, and it's called the automatic behavior box. Now, what happens with the automatic behavior box is that behavior that is recycled over and over again, the story that creates that behavior gets put into that box along with the activity that goes with that story. And every time that story is triggered, our behavior follows along. So we know how to drive a car. And there we go. One of my favorite stories, there was a movie called Starman, and this fellow comes in from another planet and is learning how to do the things we do. And so he's driving along with the star of the movie. She's typical American, driving through wherever it was. And she gets tired, and there comes a time that the alien who has been watching all of this jumps in the car, and now it's his turn to drive. And as he's driving, there's a light that goes yellow, and he slams on the gas pedal to make that car go as fast, and there's a hay truck coming the other way, and it goes every dang where. Scares the poor woman half to death, who goes, "What the heck are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I was watching you drive, and every time the yellow light came on, you hit that gas pedal as hard as you could." And so you can see in her story that yellow lights were part of the play, that you go as fast as you can to get through the yellow light. Not exactly the conservative way to drive, but it was a part of her driving behavior. And it was so rote and so normal that her automatic behavior showed up again and again enough times that the alien who was just onboarding that behavior said, "Oh, that's obviously how this must need to happen." Automatic behavior. So if you think about it, we all develop automatic behavior, and we store it in the box. And a lot of times as we get to be adults, we start to think that, wow, my behavior doesn't work. And one of the kind of psychological practices, now remember, I'm speaking egoically now, so I'm talking about assuming the ego story is in place. We say, oh, well, maybe the thing that triggers the automatic behavior, if I bring that into awareness again, I can rewire the automatic behavior. And that seems to work. Not a problem there. However, think of how many of those stories you're holding in the automatic behavior box. Heaven only knows. I mean, you've got a lifetime of living. So there's a lot of behavior that's automatic: cultural behavior, functional behavior, whatever it is that your career includes, whatever it is you do for your family, how you relate within your family. Some families, an emergency occurs and the automatic story is we yell and scream. Other families are we go really, really quiet. Other families have a certain person that's disliked throughout the family, so everybody joins in and does that. There's all sorts of automatic behavior in family situations. Now, the place that we find that the most is in our primal behavior. That's our childhood behavior. So as a child, that is when you're taught how to be an ego. That's the teaching of the ego moment. So now it's said that there are three basic patterns in childhood behavior. And I liken this to, by the way, I use the theater as my example on this one. This is my story. So imagine a theater and imagine the stage, and imagine that all the seats are numbered and there's a beautiful marquee outside that tells you what the play is and who produced it and who the stars are and all the things that you would find in that kind of a format. And so there are three types of folks that walk into the movies, and here are the three categories as I put them together, and they represent the three behaviors that children engage in a lot. The first one I call autocratic. Autocrats are folks that believe that they're in charge. But when you take it into the movie situation, here's what autocrats do. They get on stage and they dance and they sing because in order to feel safe and secure, they feel that holding attention is how to do that. So if they can hold everyone's attention, they feel safe and they feel secure. It's a childhood need. Now, what happens, of course, is that gets put into the automatic behavior box. So people that have autocratic styles of behavior, they have a tendency to use play that one key on the piano all the time. That's the one they play. That's what I chose. For whatever reason, I had the ability to speak and entertain and do whatever. So my father, for instance, who was a very angry kind of a guy, if I could get him to crack up or if I could entertain him in some way, I could a lot of times move around what the impending doom was that was approaching me, or so I felt. So that's an automatic behavior kind of a style. Then we have what we call a conforming style. So when you're conforming or complying is the other word. So imagine all those seats that have the numbers on them. Remember we talked about those guys. So when all the seats that have the numbers on them are, in play, then you go and the person goes into the theater, they find their number, they clap at the right times, the curtain opens, the curtain closes, the person sings, they do all of the right things at the right time. The play gets over, they get up, they file out and they go home. Because what they've learned is if they can become part of the whole body of everyone and they do all the things that they're supposed to do, that keeps them safe and secure. Same motivation, right? They just picked a different behavior. Now what happens to those folks? They put that into their automatic behavior box and pretty soon that's what gets triggered up most of the time. Now the third style is what we call the critiquing style and or distancing style. And that's particularly intellectual because what that is the person who walks up to the marquee and they start to speak about what's there. And they start to say, oh, this is produced by so-and-so, it's at this theater, here are the actors, and they start to critique the movie. And what that does is it allows them to feel distance from what it is that they're critiquing. So it's a distancing behavior, the critical thinking style. And what does that give them? It makes them feel safe and secure. So those are the three basic defenses. The reason I bring that up is because at the childhood level, the stories that you onboard in your automatic behavior box are the ones that show up again and again and again. So why is that important? I mean, I'm sure everybody's sitting here going, wow, Alan's talking about Alan's talking about ego today. That's not his normal approach. But here's why it's important. The story that you tell yourself when it is in action, it does another thing to all of us, is that it conforms to the agreement that we are an autonomous author of our own journey. So we believe that as a separate entity, we are pulling all the levers and making all the decisions that give us that particular story. Even though the story is unconscious, the essence of feeling separate, because who else needs to feel safe and secure but someone separate? Consciousness doesn't really have that need, but a body mind that believes they're an entity has that need. So what's going on is that deeply held particular story is the one that also continues to confirm to us that we are a separate autonomous author of our own journey. And so we start to have to tease those. In the process of doing what we're doing, we're always using pointers to try to basically dissolve the stories that we hold, either consciously or unconsciously. It doesn't really matter, because all activity ultimately is story-based. So the way to unwind a behavior is to find the story behind it. Now, last time I think I talked about how conflict is a function of believing that there can only be one story. So we believe there's such a thing called truth, and it has to have one story. And if you go out on Facebook, you can see people arguing about what that one story needs to be. So we believe we can use our intellect, claim the best formation intellectually, and supposed facts that we assemble. And then if we can kind of dominate the conversation, so that means we need to be witty and really good at this. And if we can do all of that stuff, we are now the proud owners of something called truth. Now, I would think that if that were true, that you would feel really, really good and you wouldn't need to go back the next day on Facebook and do it again. But that doesn't seem to hold true. Facebook seems to be something that once somebody is doing it, they need to go in every day. So this finding truth thing looks a lot like addictive behavior to me. So something to think about. But what begins to happen is when you look at the story, remember the first example I used, the fellow driving down the freeway that cut you off because he was a total idiot, or he's trying to get his daughter to the hospital. When you tell yourself one of those two stories, you get completely different responses internally. Well, there's a place even beyond that, where when you can hold two stories at the same time, there's no longer a conflict that lives inside of you that says one of those stories has to be true. So the motivation internally to try to make one of those stories true drops away. That's what happens holding two stories at the same time, which we all have the ability to do. So you could say, oh, that car cut me off. It could be the guy's a total jerk, or he's on his way to save his daughter because he needs to get to the hospital. I wonder which way that is. So you find that when you hold two stories at the same time, the charge of holding one story tends to dissipate. It goes away. So I'm gonna, today I had a conversation, and I'm famous for doing this, using conversations in public, but I was talking to Jim next door, and he was talking about how he and his wife, when conflict arises, that if they kiss each other, it immediately goes away. And I said, oh, that's really great. That kissing in a way is the physical holding of two stories at the same time, isn't it? I mean, you have your typical argument between husband and wife, and you kiss each other. There's an energetic way in which you can't hold that your story is right and hers is wrong, typically when a kiss is exchanged. So that's the physical notion of what I just said mentally, which is holding two stories seems to take the charge out of life. Now, why is that? Well, holding two stories requires what we call witnessing. And it places you as an observer of yourself and as an observer of everybody else. Now, we all live in consciousness, and I don't want to shake anybody's foundation here, but Whenever you can look at yourself and everyone else, that's the point of view of consciousness itself. We call that witnessing. But when you are sure that it's your story and it has to be yours, you're identified with that one thing as against every other thing that there is. And we call that identification. And identification is what creates the bondage that we feel in terms of driving us into spiritual seeking. Why? Because it's a separation. It's a story that says, I am separate. I don't know if you see that being an autonomous author of your own journey sounds really awesome, doesn't it? Gosh, that's a lovely thing to be. But it clearly is a separate thing because every other journey is a separate thing happening. And we nest on that separateness. And that separateness is what naturally makes us feel like we're in bondage, because by nature, we're not separate. Consciousness is not a separate thing. All there is one thing. All there is consciousness. And so when that happens, when it's seen that that's the case, it can also be seen that all of the identification with separation is what created our misery. Misery is when something happens differently than what you want to have happen. That's what Buddha would have called the source of all misery. So it's that difference. It takes separation to create differences. I don't know if you can see that or not, but that's why this conversation about the story that makes us feel separate and then having it in you as an automatic behavior is actually a wonderful thing to get you to a certain point, but it's also the thing that made you start to feel in bondage or somehow limited. And it's what drove you to say, there must be something deeper here. And then you find folks that create pointers to something deeper, because the separation doesn't get solved within separation. Remember that the intellect is a machine of separation. It takes things and takes them out. It looks out in the world and takes pieces out and leaves pieces behind. Conversations are about one thing but not another. The very activity of intellect is a separation activity. So totally great. It's a great navigation tool. It's great to have it as a body-mind, but it lives as a separating activity. That's what intellect does. And it sits on top of consciousness itself, which is the activity of holding everything as one thing, because that's how it started and that's what it is. And it's not, when I say one thing, by the way, that's actually the wrong way to say it, because language leaves me with this thing where I'm saying one thing versus any other one thing. I'm trying to say that there is no things actually. There's no such thing as separation. That's the state of consciousness. And intellect lives on top of that consciousness in order for a body mind to function in the world as it's been created, which is a world of supposed egos, as if the ego activity is what's happening in front of our eyes. So that's what I wanted to just explore that with you, so you can start to take a look at your story. So where does consciousness hide? Consciousness is the sense of existence. That's where you will find it within yourself. If you close your eyes and go inside and say, can I sense, can I feel, do I know that I exist? Now that's just the body mind. Does this body mind exist? Does it know that it has a presence and it exists? And the answer to that is it's pretty easy, right? I don't know if anybody closed their eyes, but if you did, I'm assuming that you might not have found anything else, but you know you exist. Now, when I say you know you exist, there's no you really. I'm just saying existence is there. It can be established, felt, and actually lived within. So that's existence. That is consciousness. It's here and now. It's prior to language. There's no division in it. And it is the place that all meditation techniques, those are just devices to try to take you to that place and show you that that's really where life is happening. As I said before, the mind records all the stuff as though it's happening in a movie. But if you think about it, you're sitting in one place as the sense of existence. So there's no you moving through the movie. The movie's actually moving through you. You're the one thing that's constant in the movie is you being there. Now it's the part that we forget because we're running the movie in our head and imagining that there's a you that's living through the movie. So even a lot of times in the moment, we're playing the movie in the moment as though that's happening right then, but it's not. You're just there. No definition. There's nothing there but you as consciousness. And you can, at any time you want, just simply sit on that I am. It's called the I am, by the way, or the sense of consciousness, or the I exist. And a very famous Nisargadatta, who I speak about a lot, said that when he went to his guru, he told him, go just be with the I am, don't do anything else, do that. And he said, and that's what I did. And so that became the entirety of what it was that that Nisargadatta did, and his awakening occurred, because what happened is the world started to appear as a different kind of a story than all of the stories that have us in them as an ego. It's a different story when the world arises and all you are is presence itself, or consciousness itself, or the sense of existence, or I am. Any of those things will work, right? So whenever you start to talk about consciousness, I get a lot of questions, and they'll say, well, can't we take consciousness and look at it and say, here's where we are in the process? And the answer is, the only way to do that is to have a memory tape of what is run, and to look in the rear view mirror and say, oh, those must be the stops along the way, and assume that they are. But the reality is, no, there are no division lines in consciousness itself. Consciousness is completely a non-separate, or what they call sometimes non-dual state of existence. That's all it is. And state's even a bad word, but it's the sense of existence. Everything is in that sense. Your mind is in that sense. The stories that you run are in that sense. That's who you and what you are. And every time that sense is evoked and the scene from that sense happens, a different kind of story is seen, different than all the other ego stories. That's what happens. And so you'll meet a lot of people and they're doing what we call toggling. They're having moments of awakening and then moments where they're back in ego. That's normal. All that means is that the story is being seen from consciousness, and it flips back to being seen from the ego. That's all. That's all that's going on when that's happening. So if that's happening to you, don't worry about it. Carry on. It's exactly what happens, right? But the whole thing is to get, if you can get that to happen, you know, it didn't used to happen. So if it's happening now, then that means that in the moment, that consciousness is actually now suggesting itself in such a way that the mind is creating a story that goes with it from that point of view, from that apperception, which is the perception from consciousness, not the perception assuming that you're an ego. So those are the differences between those two places, and why I walk through automatic behavior and all of the rest of it. So what's the answer to that? See, we would think, well, we need to change the story. And actually the way to change the story is simply to be the witness and watch the story. Go to the place where you are, existence itself, and watch the arising and just witness it. Don't worry about the rest of it. Don't need to track it in your head. Don't need to do anything. Just sit and watch it arise and watch it go by. That's the thing that one can actually do that starts to feed a different story, a living understanding that's different than the living understanding of egoically living. That's what happens in that particular exercise. Because someone will ask me every now and then, they'll go, hey, what can I do in order to begin to see these things? So now it's easy. It's like, oh, somebody cut me off. There's the two stories, right? Could have been this and it could have been that. Impossible to hold two stories with without observing yourself hold two stories. That's a form of witnessing. And you'll notice the charge isn't there any longer. No charge, no identification. Charge always comes with identification. Those two things go together. So if you're really angry about something, high likelihood that you're identified. If you watch yourself getting angry about something, notice that the charge of anger isn't the same as when you're totally identified with it. Anger is a fun one to play with because you can deal with anger by just watching it. What will happen is even the remnants of anger will go away after a while, and your anger actually will take on an entirely different sense. Anger still comes up, but you know it's not yours. That's what happens. That's what happens with anger. That's what happens with everything. You start to see it's not yours. You just simply are a conduit through which it moves. And that's what witnessing gives you. So you can practice. That's the practice. Sitting on the I am and watching the dramas that are created within your mind and going, oh, look at that story. Look at that story. There's a story. That's an interesting story. And you will begin to see that the charge in life itself leaves. So what is it that awakening gives you? A sense of permanent peace. Isn't that a life with no charge? If there's no charge at all in your life and all you're doing is seeing it arise and fall, one would think that you're at permanent peace. And consciousness it lives at permanent peace, and all of the things that happen inside of it simply rise and fall with no charge. How does it get that charge? Well, humans come along and assume they're separate and intellectually construct something, and they put a charge in there. Charges exist in separateness. In non-duality, no particular charge, even though the same things happen, but they're experienced in an entirely different way. All right, that's it. All right, here you go. If there's no doer or doing, can we consciously do something, or is this another story? So that's a question from Jim. So the ultimate answer, here's what I always say. The ultimate answer is no. There's nothing you can consciously do to do that. However, as long as you believe that that's what's going on, that's no problem. Just live it that way. Let yourself relax and live it that way as though you're the one doing it. Only watch. Watch it as it's being done. By adding the watching as it's being done, it begins to transform, and it will be, and you will begin to see that it happens by itself, that you're just simply being lived through, that anything that's happened in your life pretty much did have to happen the way that it did. No big deal. But getting into that mental argument about whether one can do something and whether one can't do something, which is the question here, that's a waste of your time. It's got to be truth. So what I'm suggesting here is hold both stories at the same time. It feels like I'm doing that, but I'm being told that I'm not. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to assume it's one of those two, and I'm going to watch as things happen. Again, holding two stories at the same time, impossible to have much of a charge about that, because there's old Alan out there and he's doing it one way or the other, right? I'm not fighting about which one it is. I haven't adopted the fact that it needs to be one of the two. So whenever you have a question in the spiritual path about what something is, the first step is to say, let's hold both stories at the same time, right? Let's just hold them. Well, we're going to hold both stories at the same time. Could be that I'm an autonomous author and I'm the American exceptionalist, and I'm climbing the mountain and it's just me, and screw everybody else. They can do what they need to do. That's kind of the American ideal. So that's what I'm going to go do. Or it could be true that Alan is actually consciousness itself and one completely unified thing, and it's one of the two. So let's watch. Let's kind of watch. Let's watch what Alan does. We'll watch the stories that spin, and we'll hold both of those stories at the same time. And you'll start to see this urge to make one story need to be the case. That's one of the biggest enemies of the spiritual journey. I love it a lot of times because you all know I create pointers, and so I'll say, oh, new pair of jeans. The new pair of jeans pointer is a way to help people relax by saying, hey, listen, I know what I'm telling you is really odd and it feels awkward, but try it on like a new pair of jeans. But you know what? If it doesn't work, you can always go back to the old pair of jeans. And what that does is it allows somebody in the spiritual search to relax into that place, right? Now I'll have a pointer like that, and I'll have somebody and they'll say, I want to argue with you about that pointer. Now that I find that to be one of the most hilarious things ever, because the pointer is intended to put you in an experience, to put you in the phenomenal moment of being relaxed, because in that relaxation is when two stories can be held at once. It's when witnessing can happen, and it's when spiritual movement occurs. Fair enough. So of course, the pointer is about the actual phenomenal experience in the moment, nothing to do with intellect. I'm not saying that that's a right thing or a wrong thing. It doesn't hold a truth, right? You go to a pool and there's a bunch of folks standing around the pool, and what the goal of awakening or the experience is to understand what wet is. We need to understand what wet is. And so around the pool, these people are gathered and they're arguing with each other about what is wet, right? Now that they're going to be arguing about the composition of water, all of the things you argue about. Maybe there's even some physicists in the group and they can talk molecularly. That'd be awesome. So anyway, because we're making the story up here, as you imagine. So they're arguing about the truth of water. That's what wet is, right? That's an intellectual discussion about what truth is, and that's what we most of the time do, stand on the edge of the pool and argue about what the water is inside it. Now, some bozo like me or you walks up and we put a foot in one of their butts and in the water they go. And we can say, so what is wet? So when someone wants to argue with me about the truth of a pointer, I always say, well, did they get wet? Did they fall in the water? Because the pointer is the boot and the butt of someone to knock them into the pool. That's what a pointer is supposed to do. It has no other use. It can be, who cares if it's true, false, or anything in between. The question is, did you get wet? Did the experience of being here and now, did the experience of consciousness, did the sense of existence assert itself in that moment when the pointer was given to you and it was utilized in some way? So is that true? No, not true. Is it not true? It's not that either. It has nothing to do with truth. It's an activity intended to push a bystander into the pool. Now that's a pretty good metaphor actually for life, because we stand in life as a tangible arising, and then we make a story about it as though as it were literally on the outside of it, not on the inside of it. So everything that we're doing here is intended to place you on the inside of consciousness itself and have you quit pretending that somehow you stand on the outside of consciousness and you can see what's happening. Most people's conceptions of consciousness do not include themselves. So remember this, because if what you do is you like to track a lot of the conversations and the disagreements in spirituality, say you read that kind of stuff. I love that kind of stuff. But whenever I see someone arguing about the truth of something, when I recognize that there really is no reason for that, in other words, why would you do that? It really isn't germane to spiritual movement, then I see that for what it is. If I'm really interested in it, I may keep reading it, but I know that's what I know that these people or this particular writing or whatever is aimed at finding a truth in a place where there's no such thing as truth. There's such a thing as I am consciousness. I am here. I exist. That's not a truth. That's a sense. That's presence itself. And that's what consciousness is. So all of this is aimed at, what does the world look like when one is standing in consciousness? So, or standing in the pool. So what is our goal? Well, first of all, we need to get you in the pool. Because if you're not looking at life from the pool, then how could you even have a sense of what life looks like from the pool, or how it's experienced? How is life experienced? How does it arise when one is standing in consciousness, or is consciousness itself, versus thinking they're a separate story that authors their own journey? How do those two things look differently? One's egoic, separate little egos running around, all generating all these little stories, versus all of those stories simply arising and being marked and created in the intellect, which seems like a much more likely possibility. So what's it look like when one stands in consciousness itself and sees the stories as they arise? What's that difference? And that's really what the function is. Let me see. So there's no doer doing anything. Can we consciously do something? Or is this just another story? So pointers are stories. They really are. They're stories. So even when I give you a pointer and I say, hey, there's no truth there because its intent is to knock you in the pool, the pointer itself is a story seeking to basically point you in a place where the story itself doesn't happen. It gets created afterwards, so that the living is pre-story. Consciousness itself is pre-story until it gets filtered through the intellect. So that's the point of all of this speaking. You know, I often say that that the spiritual journey in some ways is akin to being asked to build a subway through the city of Los Angeles, which you're like, wow, I would love to do that because Los Angeles definitely needs a subway, no doubt about it. So how can I help? And consciousness says, here you go, here's a teaspoon, have fun. Because what we're doing here is we're creating intellectual pointers and stories to point to something that is immensely more or immensely less and more simple and all of those things, but it lives in tangibility. It lives here and now. So even as I say what I say, I'm trying to use this teaspoon to dig a subway through the city of Los Angeles, because all I have is intellect to point outside of itself. That's what's going on with a pointer. How do you point outside of intellect and not believe that the story that intellect holds is actually what your life is? How do you do that? Right? And that's the whole point of the of the spiritual journey. So it has a comedy to it, for sure, because the equipment that works so well in the egoic world isn't really suited. The intellect is inside of consciousness. The intellect believes that consciousness is inside itself. It's actually the reverse. It lives inside consciousness, and it's getting to see turning the world right side up, as it were. A lot of times I use that thing about, your vision. I don't know if you know this or not, but when you look out there, everything comes into the screen in the back of your head upside down, and your mind turns it right side up so that you can function in the world. So in a certain way, the egoic activity is one where the picture came in upside down. It never got turned right side back up. We were taught to look at it upside down. We were taught to believe we were separate. As children, when you develop these defenses as a complier or an autocrat, we learned how to drive. We learned how to do all of these things. We learned how to argue about stories, right? And we got so used to thinking that was the way it was that our world continues to exist upside down. And all awakening is when when the world gets turned right side up. That's all it is. Same stuff, just seen in an entirely different way and from an entirely different place, because upside down and right side up look a lot different. So that's another nice little, notice that's a pointer again. Intellectual story. That was a little story about vision in the mind. And so that's what that piece is. All right. Do I have any other questions rolling in here? Does somebody have one that's sitting in there in the back? If you do, pop it on the chat. Pop it on the chat, and you'll have a chance to see that. This one's for James, by the way. James, one of the ones that I really like to think about is when I was a child, I went to Disneyland. I think a lot of you probably did the same thing. And one of my favorite rides was this thing they called Autopia. Now, for those who don't know it, it's a little set of cars. When you're like a 5-year-old boy or girl, you get to get in the car, and there's a wheel in the car, right? Now, if you're an adult and you're standing on the outside, you can see that those little cars are on tracks and that the wheels are connected to nothing. But the experience of a child in one of those cars is you go down the road, you go down the track, as it were, right? And you turn the wheel and the car goes that way, and you're like, oh my goodness, what a great driver I am. Did you see that? And you go to the next turn and you turn it right and the car goes left, and you go, oh my goodness, I did that entirely wrong. And that's the child's experience of that particular ride. Now, if you think about how we track life itself, isn't that what we do? We're driving through life. All that somebody says is that when you live your absolute authentic story, as it were, underneath that living is just living itself. And so all awakening is a seeing that you are a car on the track, and the wheel that you think turns your car isn't connected to anything. And so you can kind of relax around that. You no longer have to try to make the car do anything. No, not necessary, because the car is on the track and it's happening by itself. Beautiful story, great story. And it illustrates can you consciously do something in order to affect your life? Well, if you're the car on the track, what's the answer? If you see the wheels not connected to anything, what's the answer? And what did I say? Well, pretend that the wheel's connected, and pretend that it's not connected, and see which one it is after a while. Because if you watch what we do every day, what we do is we take in all the information that proves that we're egoic, and we basically eliminate all the information that tells us we're not, so that our story holds together. That's how we make up stories that confirm that we're autonomous. And yet, if we were autonomous, think about where you are today. I guarantee you that this is not what you thought you were going to be doing or where you thought you were going to be. So if we're all powerful in making all those decisions, it's not a very incredible power. So life is living yourself. By the way, I wanted to be a philosophy professor, for those that don't know that. You can probably see a little of that in what I do, but I ended up being a practicing CPA for 40 years instead, and living a corporate career. Now, I don't know, maybe that's pretty close to being a philosophy professor, but it wasn't what I thought I was going to be doing, because instead of reading Plato, I was looking at trial balances and income statements. So those seem really, really different to me, but maybe someone can make those be the same thing. But a philosophy professor, I wasn't. And I am sure that had I had the authorship of my own journey, I would have been a philosophy professor. So that must not have been a very powerful kind of driver. And as hard as I tried, by the way, I tried to be a philosopher. I went back, I literally, at 37 years old, went back to Claremont Graduate Schools and did a master's in deconstructive philosophy. That was how dedicated I was to thinking that's what I wanted to do. And it was a lovely experience. And then I went back to doing business for the next, however long it was, until I was in my late 50s, early 60s. So that's what I did. Oh, Brad, I found it useful to think of this as redirecting my attention with the rail in the middle of the road. Yeah, great. Very similar observation. And it's just another lovely way to look at what it is that we're talking about. How do you relax into letting life live itself? What does it look like when everything that arises is simply included in the story, the stuff that fits into the theory of what it is and the stuff that doesn't? What's it look like then? You know, who's left to fight against anything when everything simply flows and there is no separation or counterpoint? What's that lifestyle look like? What does that arising look like? And so all the pointers that you see, all the pointers from Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta and you name it, Adyashanti, Muji, pick your favorite, chattering face like me, and say, what are they saying and what are they pointing at? And you're going to find same. It's all being pointed at the same place in a lot of times a much different way. I tend to kind of be a clarity person. Guess what? I was a business guy, probably would do it that way. Other people use entirely different approaches. Beautiful pointers, things that are really, really you can really embrace, and they're lovely, lovely, lovely things. But they funnel through the body mind that you are, and that's the way that they come out. Same thing you notice when people go, well, Buddha said it this way and Ramana said it that way. And I always chuckle at that, as though Ramana and Buddha could be in conflict. That has to be the most absurd notion I ever heard. How is that possible? But we can make it that way in our minds. In fact, we can have I guarantee you there are people that have written books about it. And it's all an intellectual exercise in futility. That's just what it is. It's the fruit of a barren womb. I'm sorry, it doesn't happen. That was Nisargadatta's favorite one, by the way. So that's where that one lives. All right. Thank you. I want to just stop here for a minute. And it seems like we're going to go just right at an hour tonight, but I want to stop and say, don't get lost in the words. One of the criticisms that I've heard often about what we call non-duality approaches, it's just a path, by the way. There's lots of paths in the spiritual world, and a lot of them are perfectly suited to having one awakened, that the awakening happens, no problem there. But don't get lost in the words. And the reason I say that is that the criticism is that this kind of work has a lot of people that get lost in their heads, but they're not really vibrant, and they don't live real lives. Osho used to use the term Zorba the Buddha. And when I got there, the first thing they told me was, yeah, the Zorba part you got covered, the Buddha part we need to do. Don't lose the Zorba. That's actually where we're going back to. The Buddha part, the meditation part, the intellectual pointing, all of what I've talked about, which sometimes sounds really, it gets kind of esoteric and it gets very wordy and conceptual. That's what pointers and intellect do. See, though, that it's really pointed at having the felt experience of consciousness arise through you. It's the re-engineering of how life is actually lived. So when I say go back and sit on the I am, go and sit on the I am. Go inside and go, oh, there's this sense of existence. What if I watch what arises from here? Really simple, really direct, really tangible, really here and now. Notice that when you're sitting there, that life moves through you and you are no longer moving through life. First break. Notice that from there you can hold two stories at the same time. Second break. But it's a doing. It actually is happening and arising. That's the piece that I want to anchor in here. Because when you tell a lot of stories like I have today, you can get lost in the, where you are in the theater, how it is you learned how to drive, whether you say, You're a jerk when someone cuts you off on the freeway. All of those things are really great stories. But what they're meant to do is locate your possibility in the here and now and have the experience of consciousness be what you are. That's the point of all of this. Don't lose the tangible in living. That's what we tend to do. That's why we're misidentified anyway. We went and lived in our intellectual concept and started to believe that that map, the theme music that the mind adds to everything that arises, we started to believe that's what life was itself. And then we started to believe that we could do something about it, even though it was happening and the mind was just adding the soundtrack and words. So just see that that's how it happens. Don't lose life itself. Even the toggling I talked about, that's the movement from tangible to the mind, tangible to the mind. That's what goes on. Those two stories are playing off of each other until it finally settles out. Takes a long time sometimes. That's okay. Just let it happen. The more relaxation, the quicker these things occur. But don't lose the Zorba trying to be the Buddha. That's not what's going on here. The spiritual world has a lot of people in it that look like they're the perfect saints. I guarantee you, as you begin to move through this, you're not going to probably look like that. Now, I know some of you actually might be able to pull that off, but most of you who I know are not pulling and can't pull that one off, nor should you. The authentic arising of you is simply the authentic arising of you. Don't worry about what that looks like. It's not your job. Your job is simply to be the arising that quote unquote you are. That's it. And even the stories that come along with it, that's what they are, just stories. So if you're getting caught up with what somebody thinks of you, forget that. You don't control that. That's a story that's being created in another intellect. Life is good. It lives in the egoic separation plane. Don't worry about it. You have no control about that. We spend most of our lives trying to adjust other people's view and image of us, right? That's a mental exercise. Don't lose the Zorba. Zorba didn't care. He went out half drunk, ate food, sang in the middle of the city, and had a grand old time. Go do that. Let you be you, whatever that is. Now, some of you are going to be the perfect saint. There's some of us in that world, but most of us are like me. So you're going to walk into a room, you're going to trip on the furniture, you're going to knock the glass of water over, you're a death sentence to anything technological, and that's who you are, right? That's great. So fine. Now the surprise is that you're also going to find out that whatever it is that life has to offer up to that particular body mind gets offered up. Happened that I was in the corporate world. Can you imagine someone who can't get around furniture, spills water, and is death sentenced to technology, and probably says the wrong things at the wrong time and a whole bunch of other stuff, and yet the corporate world is fine with that? Because authenticity is always embraced in whatever context it finds itself. So tangibility, remember, be who you are. That's the way. That's the way to go. Now here it is. This is really awesome. Is it trying and allowing at the same time? Yes and no. This is Donovan. You'll love this, Donovan. Here's why. Trying and allowing are basically the stories that you put with the energy that you're expending. So you know that relaxing into what is what you and I would normally call allowing, but there's no you there to do the allowing. And there's no you there to do the trying. If there's a you there, there's actually two stories. One of you is trying and one of you is allowing. And that's happening at the same time. But when there's no you there, it simply arises through you. So when trying needs to occur, it does. And when allowing needs to occur, it does. right? It happens by itself. And so it expresses itself in that way. So depending on where you are and how you see it, if it looks to you like trying and allowing at the same time, or where the action is, the answer is yes. If you see that trying and allowing can be just simply held together and they arise when they arise, then that's the answer. So it's kind of a yes and no. It's the yes and no answer. If you believe you're an autonomous decision maker, go with that until you see you're not. And if it goes back and forth, that's fine. See them both. Hold both stories. That's how to get to that place. So above all, remember, this is about the tangible sense of being. So we're about being. We're not about becoming. We're not about thinking what is. It's simply about presence and being. And when you are presence and being, the rest of it moves through you. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I had great questions. I had a good time. I hope you enjoyed the stories. And I will see you all in 2 weeks. Actually, just so you know, there is a European edition that I do. The European edition is the second and fourth Fridays. It actually ends up being noon Pacific, because that's 8 o'clock at night in England on Fridays. I don't know why the English think 8 o'clock at night on Friday is great. But anyway, and then this one happens at exactly this time on the first and third Thursdays. So you can go every week, whatever you want to do. So much love to everyone. And I will see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.